Hey, welcome back to the channel. We're going on a deep dive today to help us understand core principles. And today, that core principle is the most fundamental one of them all. It is the communication process and how it actually works, how communication actually works. Now, before I throw the model of communication that I'm going to use up on the screen, I just want to make the point here that there are dozens, maybe hundreds of models of communication. They all fit into basically three categories. And one is just one-way communication. Think about it like a radio. Another one is just two-way and it's very transactional. And then another is the simultaneous communication that happens. Each one of these is trying to model communication behavior in some way. None of them are perfect. Today, I'm just going to use the basic model because that's all we really need to use to understand what's going on. So let me get that model put up right here, and then we can talk about it. So first of all, I think you've all had this experience, no doubt, where you said something to a group of people, and maybe let's say it's three people. You said something to three people, and each one of them got something different out of what you said. This happens to me all the time in my classrooms. I have a group of 20, 30 people, and I say the instructions, I give recommendations, etc., etc. I do the lecture, and then I have people asking me questions, and we're coming from all over the place. If you have kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about there too. They tend to not hear exactly what you're saying. Now, again, we're going to look at the communication model today because we need to understand how communication actually works so that we can diagnose the problem when something doesn't work. It's like if you don't understand how the engine in your car works, how can you diagnose engine problems in your car? Same thing for anything else. You're not a doctor? Well, maybe you are, but I'm not a doctor. And so I can't diagnose most physical problems, at least ones I haven't had a lot of experience with. I can pretty much get to allergies and a cold and that kind of thing. Most of us can, but I can't go any deeper than that because I don't know how it all works. I don't have the training or understanding of how that works. So the same is true of communication. If you don't really understand how it works, you still do it, you still use it every day, just like you use a car every day. You kind of know how the machine works. If you push the button or turn the key, it's supposed to start. And if it doesn't start, maybe there's a handful of things. But then basically from that point on, you know, you put it in gear one way or the other, and then you push the skinny pedal and it goes, and you push the fat pedal and it stops. Unless you're driving a manual, and then you have to learn that other pedal. So, and you don't really need to know that much more than that to operate a vehicle. You don't necessarily need to know all of this to be a communicator, but if you want to be really good at it, really competent at it, and if you want to diagnose issues with it, and you want to go beyond just being able to have a conversation with someone, then it really helps to understand what this model here means and represents. So again, let me just remind you that this is a model. It is oversimplified like all models are. No single model can ever capture the entirety of what it is trying to model. But if you see this chart, and you've probably seen things like this, if you've taken any speech class or communication class, then you've seen some version of this particular basic communication model. This is basically like a telegraph. I don't know if you remember from your history class how we used the telegraph in the mid 1800s all the way up until the 20th century, early 20th century, and it was a very effective way to communicate. And basically, it represents what's on this screen. You had a sender, there was a person who entered in the Morse code, and that person had to encode words into these dots and dashes, and then that was the message. It got transmitted through the wires, and then there would be someone at the other end who had to hear or feel or see those dots and dashes and then decode that in their mind and then write it back into English so that the whoever needed to read it could understand it. Because most people don't read Morse code, you could take that whole thing and just submit a foreign language instead of Morse code. It'd be the same thing. I'm speaking in English. Maybe you don't speak English, so maybe YouTube is doing some some captions for you that are in English and maybe are let's say they're in Chinese and maybe they're not perfect. If you had a person translating, you would have to wait for them to translate what I say in English into Chinese. They would say it in Chinese, you would hear it in Chinese, and then you would have to translate that into meaning in your mind. We're going to get into all that stuff, but that's basically how this works. And you might notice there's something else on here called noise. There actually are other things we could discuss, but this models communication in its very basic form. It doesn't matter if you're speaking, it doesn't matter if you're writing, it doesn't matter if you're literally using sign language or Morse code. It always works this way. So let's start talking about the sender. Before we do that, I need to grab a sip of tea. Since we're doing a deep dive, we're going to be here for a few minutes. All right. So let's talk about the sender. Let's start putting all the pieces of this together. So again, look on the chart here. If you're on a small screen, I apologize, but look on the chart here and you can see that there is a sender. That sender is you. That is you. It is, you are the person who has something to say or something to write, and you are the one who then has to push it out there somehow. And so, again, are you doing it on a computer? Are you writing an email? Are you making a phone call? Are you using light blinks like Morse code if you're on a ship? It doesn't matter. You're the sender. You are where the message is coming from. And it is your job to then encode what's in your brain, what's in your mind, into symbols that another person can understand. So the symbols are what you take from your brain, from your thoughts, from all that electrochemical nonsense that's going on in your brain, and you translate that, you encode that into symbols. In English, symbols are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. They are words, they are phrases, they are ideas. Most people think of symbols, like emojis. They're things that represent something else. So the symbol for A represents that sound in the English language and many languages, for example. So I use the letter A in words that I form that need to sound like that. So that's a very, very basic idea of what's happening. So I have a thought. I need to encode that thought into words that you will be able to understand. That's what I'm doing right now. These thoughts, I have notes written down. I am looking at them. I am thinking about them. I have practiced all of this a little bit. And now I am actually putting it into words and recording it in this video so that you, as you watch the video, can understand what I'm saying. You, though, have to do something on your end, which we'll get to in a minute. But my job is to encode the ideas that I have into, in my case, the English language. That is the message. The message is that idea that I want you to understand. It's the totality of the communication that I am presenting to you. Once again, it doesn't matter whether I'm writing, so it's my email, it's a text, it's a 40-page paper for school, it's a 200-page report for work. It doesn't really matter. That is the message. And I have taken thoughts and ideas and I have encoded that into symbols that my audience will recognize and understand. So some of that means the language itself. Some of that might mean the idioms that we use, the jargon that we use. These are things that we discuss in my track method. That's the A in track, is audience, is thinking about your audience. And we'll get to that in another video. But right now, just understand that the message is what you are pushing out to the audience, whether it's one person or a million people or a billion people, it doesn't matter. It is that amount of content, as short as a text, as short as a wink or a smile and a facial expression. That is a message. Those are symbols. That's a great example. A wink, a smile, a frown, an eye roll. And we have emojis for all these for a reason. These are how we encode symbols, or we take those symbols, we understand what those symbols mean, but that's not always true culture to culture, group to group. So that's just another thing that we have to think about. But as we're encoding, what we have to be doing is taking the message, understanding what our message is, so that we can encode it in such a way that the audience can decode it as simply as possible. You may remember when you were kids, when I was a kid, we had like secret decoder rings and things we got out of, I don't know, alphabet cereal and Cheerios and things like that. And now, code is kind of a more common language, but that stuff all came from the World War II and so on, where we had secret codes and the Germans had secret codes and the Japanese had secret codes and so on. And we were all trying to break their codes. Think like communication is actually the opposite of that. If you think about what, say, the Germans were doing with their Enigma machine, is they were encoding messages so they could send them to their troops so that we couldn't read them, we couldn't understand them. And when we finally did, the British actually finally did break those codes, well, now we knew what was going on. And so the whole goal of the Enigma machine and of secret codes, the whole goal of the Americans using the Navajo code talkers and others, was to hide the message except for the people that understood the key and understood the symbols. When you're communicating with your audience, the people at work, your husband, your wife, your kids, person across the coffee table from you, your congregation, whatever it is, when you're communicating with them, you're actually doing the opposite of what the Germans were doing. You are trying to make your code as easy to understand as possible. They were trying to disguise it, to hide it. You, on the other hand, are doing the opposite. You want to make your encoding and your message as easy to understand as possible. So the message, again, is that communication. Here's where you also need to think about the organization of that message, the basic principles of, beginning, middle, and end, or introduction, body, and conclusion. Those still apply. You need to think about the organizational structure, the logic behind it. Again, look at my track diagram. You can download a track guide below if you want to do that. It's free. I've talked about it in other videos, so go back to some of the other videos on this channel. The C is where you craft this actual message, but you're taking into account this idea that you need to encode it as simply as possible. Use the best symbols, the best ideas, the best organization. All of that makes up the message. You use the best of that you know how to do to give your audience the greatest chance of understanding what you're saying. So that brings you to the decoding part. The audience actually hears what you're saying, assuming they're listening, assuming there's no noise, and we'll get to noise in a minute. The audience will hear what you're saying or read what you wrote, that kind of thing. And then those symbols go into their brain. Their brain then has to translate those symbols back into the biochemistry, right? All the chemical soup that's in our brain. And it has to then have meaning for the person who receives it. And here's a fun fact and fundamental rule. No one ever decodes exactly what you encoded. No one ever gets it 100%. I mean, you can get it down that way and you can work on that and you can be very specific. So the simpler the message, the smaller the message, the easier, more likely your audience will get it. The more complicated it is, the longer it is, that makes it less likely that they will decode it properly, if at all, and then they will get the message. That is your goal, your job as a communicator is sending this message that's easily understood, creating and sending this message that's easily understood. So as I'm decoding something, I see or hear the symbols. If those symbols mean something different to me, then I will get a different message than what you intended in some way, shape, or form. And so this is why when you're talking to a group of people or even just one person, and you think you've said it all and you've got it down, and they'll look at you and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or they'll say, is this what you meant? And you'll say, no, that's not what I meant at all. If you live very long at all, this happens all the time. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, which we will get into in just a minute. So understand that the encoding process happens in your mind. The decoding process happens in your audience mind. And so those two things aren't ever going to be exactly the same. And so you need to think about that while you're encoding the message. Something that makes perfect sense to you may not make perfect sense to your audience. And so you need to build that in. And so then that your audience is the receiver, whether it's one person, again, or a million people, a billion people, it doesn't really matter. They are receiving this message that you put out there. So you're watching me deliver this message. I hope that I am being clear. I'm trying to be clear. I'm intending to be clear. And I hope that you are receiving what I'm intending you to get. But in some way, shape, or form, probably not. Not exactly. But can I get it close? That's the best I can do. That's the idea. If I'm not very close, then I'm kind of failing in the process of being a good communicator. And that's what this channel is all about. This channel is all about trying to think through the message before we actually say it or write it, to give our audience the best chance to understand it. Because after all, that's what the intent is. I want my wife to understand what I'm talking about. I want my children to get the point of what I'm talking about. I want my class to understand. I want my church to understand. I want you to understand. I want my peers at work, my bosses, I want them to understand. If I don't care if they understand or not, then what am I even doing? So we need to spend the time here thinking about how this communication process actually works. So again, you have a sender, that's you. You encode this message that you've crafted and you've done all this work to come up with. That's another story. And then you have this message that you've built, this package that you're sending to the audience. They then have to get the package and effectively unwrap it. That's the decoding process. But their decoding will be different, most likely, than your encoding. They won't understand the symbols exactly the same way, so they will receive a message that probably isn't exactly what you wanted. So your job is to make that process as simple as possible to close that gap between your understanding and their understanding. And oftentimes that's going to take more than one conversation or more than one presentation or more than one email, text, memo, etc. And that's okay. Just understand that that is normal and that's how the process works. So don't get totally frustrated when someone doesn't understand your communication for the very first time. Now, some of that is on you, the communicator. That's what this channel is about. We can't really help what's happening with the audience. Let's talk about noise for a few minutes. You can see on the chart there's noise and these wavy lines. Noise is the fancy communication studies technical term for anything that interrupts this process. So it might actually be physical noise. It might actually be, I teach college classes. So guess what happens? People talk while I talk, especially the younger ones. And that's noise. That prevents maybe someone else from hearing what I'm saying. It's a constant challenge in most classrooms. Maybe there's literally a loud noise. One of the classes I teach is right before lunch, and it just so happens that the groundskeepers at the school are always weed eating or mowing the lawns around that time of day in that section of the campus that's right outside my window, and it's annoying and it's loud. Now I can adjust for that. You would have to get louder. Maybe you'd have to stop. I think we all understand the idea. Or you've been in one of those rooms and it has a presentation set up and you plug it in and there's this kind of this hum coming out of the speakers and it's really annoying. I've been in those classrooms too. I'm sure we all have. Maybe it's kids crying in church, those kind of things. I actually don't think that's a problem. I love that. But that is noise and it does interrupt people. But noise doesn't have to be a physical noise. Noise could also be your technology doesn't work the way you want. This is the challenge when you rely on PowerPoint or Keynote, some kind of technology. There will always be a time where it doesn't work. And so that creates noise. That creates an interruption in the communication process. So we got to take into account for that kind of stuff. But noise can also be internal. So there's external noises, literal challenges that get in the way, but there's all kinds of internal noise too. What's going on in the mind of the receiver, of the audience? What's going on in your mind that might prevent you from being as good as you can be at encoding? Maybe something bad happened. Maybe your audience or someone in your audience, this probably won't be your whole audience, but let's suppose you have an audience of 20 people in the room. One of those people, their parent just passed away. You know what they're thinking about? They're thinking about that. They're probably not as thoughtful about work. Maybe their pet died. Maybe they're having some, marital problems. Maybe they're having a problem with their child. Maybe it's some good thing that happened. They're looking forward to celebrating their birthday or their anniversary, or they're about to go on a trip, so they've kind of mailed it in for the last couple of days that week at work, right? I mean, we've all been there. That is noise. That's stuff that's going on internally in our minds. Maybe it's something as simple as they're hungry, and you might get a literal noise because the stomach growls, right? Everybody laughs a little bit, the stomach growls. And then if you're hungry, what are you thinking about? It is difficult to do any kind of teaching or presentation right before lunch because everybody's hungry. Everybody's thinking about lunch. They're thinking less about you and what you're saying. And that's kind of a maybe one of the bad spots in the day. You also don't want to be there at the end of the day. Everyone's thinking about going home. That is noise. Those things get in the way. Noise can also be literal language barrier. If I speak English and you speak Chinese, there's not even noise. There's just nothing. All you're hearing is noise. All I'm hearing is noise. There's zero decoding that happens. So it could be all kinds of things, but it's really anything and everything that gets in the way, that interrupts this process of the sender encoding a message and sending it and having that message decoded and received by the audience. That's noise. And this happens over and over and over. I don't think I've ever experienced a communication situation or setting where there isn't noise. Maybe the simplest of text or something like that might avoid most of the noise. But even then, are they getting the text? Is that text one among, 100 other texts that this person gets? Are they busy when the text came in? All that interrupts the immediate process. So again, we have a sender, that's you, that encodes ideas into symbols. That becomes the message. Think of the message as this package that you're sending to your audience. They then have to take the package and unwrap it or decode it in their own minds. They need to understand those symbols, and then they will get a message. So understanding this process now, this is what it does for us. When someone doesn't understand what we're saying, we can look at these elements. We might say, first, is there some external noise? Is there some reason why they didn't hear or weren't able to read what I wrote? Maybe the spelling's really bad. Maybe the copy's really bad. Something like that. Again, we're looking for these external sources. We're looking for sources of noise. What is it that prevented the decoding process from happening, maybe at all, or only being partially complete? And then we might start looking at, well, there's nothing really there. Everything seems to be fine. So then we look at, did I encode the message in a way that the receiver can decode it? So we're looking at symbols. Do they understand the words that I use, the terms that I use? Did I define terms that they would have been unfamiliar with? If I didn't, well, then they're not going to be able to decode the message. So I can look at my message and say, oh, I didn't define these 6 terms, which then basically derailed the whole decoding process for this audience because they didn't have that previous knowledge. This is why thinking about your audience is so important when you're crafting your message, to make sure that you're not encoding symbols that they won't understand. And so again, you're looking at that. You're like, did I put a message together that was logical, or did I get things out of order? Did I miss a step? Did I skip something? Did I get things did I get ahead of myself? There's a lot of things that can go on here. So now I'm able to look at each one of these steps and decide where the challenge is. So if the challenge is it's an external noise, well, then you turn it off, you shut it off, you move to a different area. Everything's too loud, you get everyone to be quiet so then they can hear that. I do that in class all the time. If they're mowing outside, maybe I have to stop and wait for a minute or two while that happens. Sometimes my students are giving their speeches when this happens. And while I try to encourage them to just deal with some of the distractions and so on, occasionally it's so bad, I just tell them to stop and we'll wait and we'll restart and we'll do it when that's over. Maybe again, the problem is the symbols. You need to make sure you're defining your terms and giving the right symbols. Maybe your receiver just doesn't have enough knowledge at all to understand what you're talking about. Maybe you were having a bad day and just oversimplified or overcomplicated the message that day. Again, you are able to look at it and diagnose where the problem is so you can fix the problem, fix the bottleneck, just like any other machine, any other process, figure out where it breaks down so that it can continue, not just continue, but continue successfully. Remember, your goal is to be understood. Everything you do as a communicator, thinking about this process here, everything you do should go toward how easy can I make it for my audience to understand what I'm saying? I want them to get my point. So there's a lot there. There's probably more we could talk about. Again, lots of other models that get into different elements that may be involved. Those are higher level things. And maybe one of these days we'll get into those things. I appreciate you listening. Again, I want to turn your attention to the link down below where you can free download my quick track guideline there. And it will run through TRACK, this process to build a clear message, because this is really what it boils down to. You need to employ clear thinking so that you can create a clear message. That clear message then brings clear communication. And by understanding how this process works, you then can figure out the problem when it doesn't. You can smooth out the process by putting the effort in the right places as you create your message, as you create your talks, as you create your emails, as you create those reports for your bosses. And even just writing a few things down before you make that phone call can have a real impact on having a clear message for your audience to decode. Again, thanks for watching. Check out some of our other videos on the channel. They're all dedicated toward being a better communicator, being a more competent communicator. You do not need to be a world-class orator or a world-class Shakespearean actress to be a competent communicator. You just need to apply common sense and clear thinking to your message, and then give it a little practice. And I promise you, you will be there. And you will be ahead of everyone else who refuses to even try.